We're going to talk about the transformation of functions. Now we're going to move to absolute value function. So as you remember, absolute value function is defined as absolute value of x. And remember that the way that we define absolute value function was if x is larger than or equal to, let's just write it down, larger than 0, then you get your x back. If x is exactly at the origin, you get 0 back. And if x is a negative number, you have to have a minus sign in front of your x. Very good. So what are the transformations of this function? If I add a numerical value to my x, what happens to my x? Remember the graph. What was the graph like? You have a V-shaped graph. Always start by graphing the function. We can use point plotting. So if x is 0, my absolute value of x is 0 at this point. If x is positive 1, absolute value of 1 is 1. So that's why at 1, I have 1. And if x is, for example, negative 1, I get minus 1, which is plus 1. So at negative 1, I have 1. So I connect these points together and I have a V-shaped graph. Now, if I add or subtract some numerical values to my function, what happens to the function itself? F of x plus 1. In this case, I get absolute value of x plus 1. I'm changing my x value. So this guy becomes x plus 1. So if x plus 1 is positive, what do I get back? I get x plus 1 back. Or you can rewrite this. If x is more than negative 1, I get line x plus 1. If x plus 1 is equal to 0, or another simplification, if x is exactly negative 1, I get absolute value of negative 1 plus 1, which is 0. I get 0 back. And if x plus 1 is less than 0, or if x is less than negative 1, what do I get? I get this negative sign in front of the whole quantity, minus parenthesis x plus 1. So this happens to my function. I get this new function. If x plus 1 is positive, I get line x plus 1. If x plus 1 is equal to 0, or if x is negative 1, I get 0 back. That's the definition of the function. And if x plus 1 is less than 0, or x is less than negative 1, I get negative this quantity, x plus 1, which is negative x minus 1, a decreasing line. You can easily graph this function. Now here you have x, and you have absolute value of x plus 1. So if x is equal to 0, I get absolute value of 0 plus 1, or 1, and I get 1 back. If x is equal to negative 1, I get absolute value of negative 1 plus 1, or absolute value of 0, or 0 back. If x is, for example, negative 2, what do I get? I get absolute value of negative 2 plus 1, or absolute value of negative 1, or 1 back. Very good. If x is, for example, 1, let's plug in another positive number. I get absolute value of 1 plus 1, or absolute value of 2, or 2 back. Let's graph this function. I'm going to use a different color so we can compare these together. 0 and 1, all right? When x is 0, you get 1 back. When x is negative 1, you have a 0. At 0, you have a 1. So this is negative 1 and 0. Negative 2 and 1. So here. And when x is 1, you get a 2 back. This point is just right up here. So if I connect these together, as we expected, we have a shift to the left-hand side. Adding a positive number to my x causes a shift to the left. Perfect. So what if I subtract a number? What happens if I have f of x minus 1? So I get absolute value of x. Now your x is replaced by x minus 1. Absolute value of x minus 1. This guy is equal to, following the definition, the quantity. If the quantity is positive, you get that quantity back. The quantity is x minus 1. So if x minus 1 is positive, or if x is more than 1, I get this line x minus 1. If x minus 1 is equal to 0, or if x is 1, I get what back? I get 0 back. And if x minus 1 is less than 0, if x is less than 1, what do I get? I get this minus sign in front of the quantity, whatever that quantity is, x minus 1. So let us graph this using some points. Point plotting is the best way, the best practice before jumping into using technology. So if x is equal to 0, I get absolute value of 0 minus 1, or absolute value of negative 1, or 1. If x is, for example, 1, what do I get? I get absolute value of 1 minus 1, or absolute value of 0, which is 0. If I plug in 2, for example, I get absolute value of 2 minus 1, or absolute value of 1, which is 1. If x is negative 1, for example, I get absolute value of negative 1 minus 1, which is absolute value of negative 2, or 2 back. As you expected, we are shifting this function 1 unit to the right-hand side. So let's use a different color here. Okay. So 0 and 1. 1 and 0. 2 and 1. Negative 1 and 2. Take a look. Let's connect these together. And we have the graph of absolute value of x minus 1. And the red one is the absolute value of x plus 1. And this black one is the absolute value of x. Well, we can just shift it up and down by adding, subtracting some values to it. So f of x plus 1, take a look how I write this down. I have my y value plus a value like 1. This is equal to, my function is absolute value of x. I'm adding 1 to the y value. I'm not changing my x. X stays the same inside the absolute value. Okay, so what happens to this function? It says, hey, wherever you see y, you just jump this 1 unit up. Take a look. I have my x, absolute value of x plus 1. If x is equal to 0, what do I have? Absolute value of 0 is 0 plus 1, which is 1. If I plug in 1 here, I get absolute value of 1 plus 1, which is 1 plus 1, or 2. If I plug in, for example, negative 1 here, I get absolute value of negative 1 plus 1, which is 1 plus 1. Again, I get 2. Very good. So let's take a look at this. 0 and 1. This point right here. 1 and 2. Add 1, it jumps 2. Negative 1 and 2 is just right here. So this is the graph of absolute value of x plus 1. Absolute value of x plus 1. And this guy was absolute value of x minus 1. Everything is inside absolute value. And finally, if I subtract a number from my y value, f of x minus 1 is absolute value of x minus 1. I'm subtracting 1 unit from it. So I'm going to write this here, x and absolute value of x minus 1. If I plug in 0, I get absolute value of 0 minus 1 or negative 1. If I plug in 1, I get 1 minus 1 or 0. If I plug in negative 1, I get absolute value of negative 1, which is 1 minus 1 equal to 0. Let's take a look at this. Color here. Okay. Pink. Okay. 0 and negative 1. 1 and 0, negative 1 and 0. So this is going to be the graph of absolute value of x minus 1. Vertical shift, 1 unit downward.